Hi family, Peter Alcoholic. As I was coming in tonight, I told her I was going to say a little something about her. This little gal touches my heart, and as soon as I heard that there's another Miracle Mabry baby on the way, I couldn't help but light up a little bit when I saw her tonight, and right after I said that, she started fixing the collar on the back of my suit, and I mentioned something about perfection, and she said, "She's got this." And so some things never change, but I sobered up in Texas, but I moved here in 2005, and it was just in time to watch this pretty little street gal come into the rooms and turn into one hell of a woman. And, that's what this program is all about. She represents one of many. And that's one of the reasons why I keep coming back here. I sobered up in Texas February 7th of 1994, a little town called Abilene. Did an awful lot of traveling to get there. A little bit of housekeeping or house cleaning, whatever you want to call it. My home group is the Keeping It Sober group. We meet down there in that Wilder building twice a week. Tuesday evenings, 8 o'clock, open discussion. Saturdays, we have a speaker meeting format very similar to this one. I was thinking how I often hear in these rooms that I never got the manual. I never got the manual. Well, I got the manual, and I even got the models. I'm the oldest of 6 children. And my brothers and sisters remind me of that often these days. 3 boys on top, triplet sisters on the bottom. Born into a middle-class family. Nothing out of the ordinary, just your vanilla ice cream, middle-class family. And my mom and dad didn't drink. They had their social gatherings. My father was a corporate pilot, so he obviously wasn't a saucer. But over the years, even as a young boy, there weren't too many alcoholics. I was born into what you might call an English, Irish, Canadian, French, Catholic family. To say that I was predisposed to drink from early on would be an understatement. My first, significant gift came at my infant baptism, and it was a 5th of Seagram 7 with a baby nipple taped to the top of it. All 6 of us kids got that. Mine never made it to the age of 21. Theirs did, and they got to share it with their relatives. But I didn't see a whole lot of drinking going on except for social in my life. I'm one of those guys that errs on the side of a spiritual malady. I was born with this. I didn't drink and cross any line because from a very young age, I was incredibly uncomfortable in almost every environment that I found myself in. I remember we did have about 3 or 4 aunts and uncles that we trotted out about 3 or 4 times a year for different holidays and birthdays, and I was fascinated with them. They were the drinkers. I was fascinated with their behavior. I would just literally sit there as a child and watch these people. That old saying, the guy with the lampshade on his head really is having more fun at the party. Well, we had about 2 of those in the family, but we didn't see them very often. And of course, I'm not old enough to make any connections about where this interest is going. But I did find myself always feeling the need to perform. If I could perform on an athletic field, if I could perform behind a set of drums when I was playing music, if I could perform in academia, I felt comfortable. But you take me out of that environment and put me in a social environment, I had no skills. I had no skills to speak of. And the ones that I did have, I acquired with some drinking, and they were artificial in nature. I think I had my first drink, if you will. I was sipping on the suds as a baby and all that stuff for a little kid when bringing a beer to daddy or whatever. But I think I had my first drink with a bunch of guys my age, somewhere around 13 years old. And I drank right into a blackout. I had a great time, so they told me, and they decided they weren't going to do this, but I got up the next morning feeling like crap, and I couldn't wait to do this again. And that seems to be a general story in here. So I was moving along in sports pretty well, and I had some scholarships at a very young age, and had a medical situation that I was born with, a character defect. Amen. Physical defect to accompany the character defect, and found myself losing all of that at about 16 years old, 15 and a half, in that area. And that's when my drinking really began to accelerate. Because what I really wanted to do, I no longer had access to. When you go from about 4'7" in a 40 down to about 6'5", nobody wants to hand you a football or let you run any bases in a baseball field. And but I was always forgetful of the other gifts that the God of my misunderstanding at that time had given me. I had a gift in music, which I was pursuing, and I also had a gift in academia. And it all came real easy to me. I didn't have to work hard to do much of anything in my life. I truly was a half measures kind of guy. I could pump out about 40 hours worth of work in 20 hours, and I did that all my life. My father decided he wasn't going to let me hang out around the house and drink and do schoolwork and all that good stuff, or go to college. So my treatment center in 1972 was the United States Air Force, and that's where he sent me. Big mistake. That's where my drinking accelerated. That's where I met all the professionals in my life at a very young age. I actually started playing music professionally about that time, and I was making more money playing music on a Saturday night than I was the whole month in the United States Air Force. So as soon as Richard Nixon decided to de-escalate the Vietnam War, and he was bringing back about 500,000 troops from the Asian theater somewhere around 1972 and a half, 3, he offered a bunch of us early outs with all of the perks that we had for our initial sign up. I took it, and I went on the road playing music. And I did that for about 3.5 years. What a great time I had. I hear this word functional drunks in here, functional alcoholics. We were having it's kind of a contradictory statement, a battle of the bands one time at the Grand Ole Opry. How the hell do you have a battle of the bands at the Grand Ole Opry? But we were there, and I figured this is something I can do with one stick and one leg, so I'm drinking my tail off, and I couldn't sit on the crown behind the set of drums. So they found me an old bar stool, wooden one, with a back on it, and they cut the legs off so the seat was the same height as the crown, and they strapped my butt into that thing, and that's how we got through that concert as a functioning alcoholic. So, and there are other things that as I pass on down the road, I'm going to qualify myself a little bit, then I'm going to get into recovery, because that's where I really enjoy my life today. As a functioning alcoholic in the business world, I got out of that and got into the business world because I just wasn't going anywhere. It's great to make a hell of a lot of money, but when you can't do anything like buy a house, I'd buy all kinds of cars in cash, but I couldn't buy a house. It wasn't quite that level in that industry. So I got out, got into the business world, and I kind of came into the business world somewhere around the mid to late 70s. And most of my mentors came out of the, you all seen that series, The Mad, executives there, out of the 50s. I mean, the drinkers, the smokers. I had the big ashtray, the big copper-colored ashtray on my desk, and most of my mentors came out of that era. The harder you drank, let's just say the last one standing usually got the deal. They loved to haul me out with the marketing department. I was more in the production, plant management, things of that nature. But they'd haul me out there and I'd be the last one standing. We'd get the deal most of the time. And that worked real well until it didn't work. Then I decided that a friend of mine went to Texas somewhere around the late 70s, and just a strange set of circumstances. He went to work for American Airlines, and he called me up and he says, "Peter, you have got to come to Texas." I said, "Okay." I had about 3 weeks, and I decided to go to Texas. And I never saw so many pools, bikinis, alcohol, drugs, you name it. And after about 10 days, I'm leaning over the fence looking at the South Fork Ranch. And I looked over at him and I said, "I have got to get to Texas." And I was in Texas about 3 to 6 months after that. I started a career down there in retail, completely flipped over. I met some guys down there that owned a private chain of Firestone stores. There were about 120 of them. And I eventually had all those stores underneath me. We sold them back to Firestone, and I kind of retired somewhere around 36 or something like that after the sale. And that's about the time I began to bottom out. And I sobered up at 37. And interesting scenario, my wife at the time was a family of 6. I was living down on Ocean Drive in Corpus Christi. And show you how a functioning alcoholic thinks. Everything disappeared quickly. Assets, cash, everything. And found myself with my family of 6 living with my in-laws in Abilene, Texas, thinking everything was fine. It was so fine that my in-laws moved out of their own house because they couldn't stand what was going on underneath their own roof. Well, it was shortly thereafter that my wife at the time looked at me and said, "Peter, you got to go and get some help so that I can get well too." And I found myself walking the streets of Abilene, Texas the next day. 2 hospitals, one on the north side, one on the south side. And the north side was the older one, south side was the newer one. Both had treatment centers, counseling, detox, and all that stuff in them. And the isms die hard. Found myself approaching the north side hospital, which was about a 4-mile walk. And I said, I'll bet that south side hospital is a little newer. They probably can take care of me better. Wasn't quite ready to go in there, so I spun around and I'm heading back the other way. And I've got about 12 miles to get to that hospital. And I'm kind of tired of walking, so I saw this church. I'd been to it, and I just happened to walk over and sit down on the front porch there. It was a Thursday, I believe, because there was no one around. And a pastor just happened to be driving by. And he came up and he says, "What's going on?" And that was the first time I broke. And he took me inside, and we got a little bit more information out. And then he put me up in this little hotel, more like a motel, in the red light district of Abilene, Texas. I mean, you got to come in and drive through the little overhang there, and there's the pool, and it's kind of horseshoe shaped, and there's no water in the pool. There's a big barrel in there, and there's a fire. It's February. They're partying down there. The music's going. I'm exhausted. No way I'm getting into that. Well, I had an 800 number and a self-help book in my hand, and so I went in. I just crashed for the night. My feet were sore. My body was sore. My heart was sore. My head was sore. I was just sore. I didn't know what I was going to do, what was going to happen. So I stayed in that motel. They put me up for 3 days and 3 nights. And on the second day, I made the phone call to the 800 number. And that's when my first sponsor, Bill, 12-stepped me. Now, when I'm talking with him on the phone, he says, "When's the last time you ate?" And I said, probably, I don't know, almost 48 hours ago. He said, "Okay, I'll be there in about an hour." So he shows up, and he's got a can of Spam, sleeve of saltine crackers, a couple of plastic forks and knives, and 2 bottles of water. That was my first AA buffet, if you will. I'd like to say that y'all feed me much better these days than my first one, and I'm grateful for that. I think he just brought that to keep me quiet while he talked. This was the first time anyone had ever spoke to me in a language that I didn't feel like challenging. How do you pick a fight with a guy who's talking about himself? Because everybody else I had ever talked with about my difficulties in life, they weren't pointing fingers at me, but they might as well have been pointing fingers at me, because it was all about what I was doing. And this fellow, to say he was sufficiently armed with information about himself, like the big book says, he literally did win me over in about an hour and a half. Now, I thought he was going to get me an extra couple of days and nights at the hotel, but that wasn't going to be the case. So I had to check out of it the following day, and I had no place to go. So I ended up heading up to Salvation Army we had in town. It was the only place that you could really stay, and that he recommended. So he went and got me a small duffel bag from the house and had some clothes in it, and I had about a 4-mile walk to the Salvation Army. So I get to the Salvation Army, I go around behind the building, because I'm still not done yet. I'm still not broken enough to really ask for what I need, even though I've just had a powerful man in my presence for 2 hours. So I go around behind the building, drop this duffel bag where the garbage cans are and all that stuff, and I go in the building, and there's this pretty little lieutenant gal sitting there. And I just walk right by her because I see the restrooms, and just go on in there and kind of tip my hand to her as I went by, and walk right back by her and tip my hand again, went out behind the building, and that's when it hit me. 2 thoughts. First of which was everything that I had ever said or done in the past was never going to work again. And that scared the heck out of me. But the one that really turned me upside down was I had no idea what would. So I picked up that bag and went back in the front door, and she was sitting there looking at me as I came in the front door, and the tears started to flow down my eyes, not out of hers, and she just looked at me and said, "I was wondering if you're going to come back in here." So they were kind enough to let me stay there for about 4 weeks as a transient, because I had already booked into a treatment center in Abilene, Texas, but they couldn't get me in for about 3 weeks. I don't know what it is about all these folks who they tell them that we can't get you in for 3 weeks and they're in the next day. What's up with that? That never happened to me. So I found myself walking the streets for another 3 or 4 weeks, and I had to get up like 5 o'clock in the morning for breakfast, leave the premises. I could come back for lunch, leave the premises, and I came back at night for the final meal, and I got to stay the night. And so that, I don't think I was still quite done yet. It dies pretty hard, this ism thing, and I found myself walking the streets of Abilene, and I would pick up change out of the gutter as I was walking. And I think I managed to accumulate somewhere around 70 to 80 cents in odd coins over that 3 or 4 week period. And Abilene, Texas had a lottery at the time. And if I managed to acquire $1 at, like 150 million to 1, I'm going to win and I'm out of here. Well, God didn't see fit to let me even do that. So as I left the Salvation Army, I threw the change in the basket and went off to my treatment center. Met some great people in that treatment center. There were about 18 of us, I think, at the time. We went to a lot of meetings. My sponsor was out of town for about the last 3.5 weeks. I was in that treatment center, so I had to find a temporary sponsor. We had to do the 5th step all the way up to writing a list for the 9th step. We had to go up through the 8th step. And how the eyes still fool you, or fool me. They gave me all the things that I needed to look at to find a sponsor. And I'm sitting in meetings, and this one guy he keeps getting my attention. I was 37, so he's probably a little older than me. He was in his mid-40s, I think, at the time. And he always wore a baseball hat. But he had this blonde ponytail that went out the back and all the way down to the middle of his back. And I'm sitting there saying, this can't be, you know. So but every time he spoke, I'd slide forward on my chair, and I just could not stop listening to him. So I finally went down to my counselor. That was another thing. She was a pretty little Arab gal, a heroin addict. First time I saw her, I said, well, you know I didn't do that, Lord. So what's this all about? But she managed to push all my buttons over the 28 days that I was there. But she made the comment, you know, when I told her what was going on, she says, well, do you want the guy to ask you? That's kind of not the way this works here. So my eyes, my ears still deceive me to this day if I'm not real close to you people as often as I need to be. Now I'm going to step forward just a little bit into recovery. I did get to do some 12-step work with my sponsor down there. The old, out into the oil field, 12-step work. I think Mickey was the first one that he took me out on. I was about four months sober at the time, and Mickey was an oil field. He worked out there with the pump jacks in a trailer that was probably, a third of the size of this room, kind of like a little line shack. And he had about 50 square miles that he tended to. And if he didn't check in with the wife every week or so, Bill got a call. So we went on out there, and there's a light on in the trailer, but nobody's answering the door. So he looks underneath there, and there's this little tiny light in the back underneath the trailer. And he says, go on under there and get him. I said, go on under there and get him? He said, yeah. He said, tell him what it was like, what happened, and what it's like now. I said, you want me to crawl under there and give him a speaker meeting talk? And he said, no, shorten it up a little bit, get him out of there, and I'll take it from there. Well, I crawled on in there, and of course my feet are still hanging out. I'm just barely under there. He says, oh, by the way, watch out for the snakes. So that was my first wet 12-step call. I went back there and found Mickey, and we got Mickey out of there, and Mickey was about 135 pounds. Meth and Jack Daniels was his preferred choice of mind-altering chemicals. But when Mickey came out of there, he was about 140 pounds. And Mickey had a ranch on cattle, and some of these pump jacks were on his property. And anyhow, Mickey stayed sober. And Mickey's about 5'10", he's a little bit shorter than I am, but he's about 220 pounds. Big old cattle-fed boy. And he wears a belt buckle on him, about this size. And he'd sit down, and I'd say, damn, son, doesn't that hurt when you sit down? And one of them boys. And it's just interesting to watch the people that I've had the privilege to have some contact with in this program. That was just one of many people that I ran across. God likes to show off in my life. I like to give this example about how gratitude and resentment can reside in me at the same time. And I have to watch that. My youngest daughter was probably 3 years old, maybe, 3.5 years old at the time. And we had a lot of ear, eye, and throat problems with her. And it's always interesting, by the time you get to the specialist, I'm right in between insurance, medical insurance. So I've got this harebrained scheme. I'm going to get what I need from the doctors, no matter what. And I'll take care of them on the backside. Well, don't ever tell your sponsor what you're thinking, unless you'd like to get some enlightenment back. Because the first word out of his mouth was, son, that's a term of endearment in Texas, very much like bless your heart here, and then they lay it on you. He says, why don't you try telling this guy the truth? So I'm in there for the initial medical review with my little girl. And he comes up to the door and starts to push it open, and I said, I really need to talk with you before we go any farther for just a minute. I said, baby, sit there for just a second, please. And so I stepped outside, and I told him what was going on. He said, well, let's get in there and see what's happening with your daughter. Long story short, the medical aspect with her is, or at that time, was big adenoids and tonsils. This little gal snored like, I do sometimes today. And so anyhow, I had my checkbook with me, and he said, we're going to have to schedule the operating room, all that good stuff. And I was going to make my token payment at the front desk, $25 or something like that, just to get started. And the receptionist looks up at me and says, Mr. House, you don't know us anything. The doctor is going to take care of this pro bono. And boy, I'll tell you, I still choke up when people do things for me like that. Nobody ever did that for me when I was drinking. Nobody. So I go home and I'm calling all my AA buddies and friends in my family, and I'm telling them how big my God is. And about 3 hours later, I get a call from the CFO of the hospital, who happens to go to church with a doctor, says, I understand you have some medical insurance issues. I said, yes, sir, I do. He said, well, we'd like to get in on the action, too. So they donated the operating room. So after everything was done, I just want you to know, I got about a $400 bill from that damned anesthesiologist. And I want you to know I spent about 2 weeks bitching about that to my sponsor, swearing I was going to pay $1 a month. He said, really, 400 months, Peter? Pay the man. So I'm not well, I'm just sober, and, you folks kind of keep me between the rails. I've been blessed to have a lot of men that I get to spend some time with. I met a fellow in Texas, a young kid. I was probably 43, 44 at the time, and he couldn't have been any more than about 26 or 7. And he saw me at a meeting one day, and he says, I'm really having some difficulties finding a sponsor. Would you consider being my sponsor? And I said, well, why don't we sit down and talk? Because I like to do that with someone that asks me that. After they've prayed about it and thought about it and all that good stuff, I like to sit down for an hour or two. It's kind of like an interview. You interview me and see if you really want me for a sponsor. And so we did that. We went to a little coffee shop in Abilene, Texas. And I knew he had something to tell me, but I just couldn't figure out what it was. I mean, he thought something was wrong with him because he couldn't find a sponsor. And so we're talking, and God, son seems like a normal sick fellow to me, just like me. And he looks at me and he says, but I have to tell you something. I said, okay, what is it? He said, I'm gay. And he must have recognized the pause in our conversation, because he looked right at me and said, but you don't have to worry. You're not my type. And I looked at him and said, what do you mean I'm not your type? I want to be somebody's type. But, and we just roared for about 15 minutes, and we ended up sitting there for almost 3.5 hours. Well, needless to say, that sponsor relationship and friendship came to be. And I got to watch this kid go through a couple of relationships, secure his career in retail. Got to watch him sponsor men without any labels on them. And, that's the kind of thing that's really thrilling to watch, how all that crap that seems to matter to people out there doesn't matter to folks in here. And the list goes on about funny things that I get to do with people. I've got a young fellow that I met here not too long ago. He works up in Raleigh now. I told him I was going to tell this story whether he was here tonight or not. But whenever my phone buzzes or rings and his name comes up, I smile. Because I know two things are going to happen. Two things. The first of which is we're going to laugh a little bit about what's going on in his life. But the second of which is I usually sit down because I know we're going to sail this sea of humanity for a little bit. And that's always the way it seems to go. He took my number over at the Wilder building. I think he didn't have a sponsor. He was probably about 7, 8 months clean and sober, something like that. And I didn't hear from him for maybe 6 weeks or so. And then right out of the clear blue sky, I get a phone call from this kid. And I hear this noise in the background. I said, "Where are you?" He said, "I'm at the ER." I said, "Well, what the hell are you doing at the ER?" He says, "My mama's trying to commit me." I said, "Well, are you crazy?" He said, "No." I said, "Well, get the hell out of there." So, it's those kinds of conversations. He now has a sponsor. I think he's an attorney up at Raleigh. Just told his story the other night. And matter of fact, I'll be playing golf with him this weekend. Most of my friends are actually from this program. I do have some friends outside of it now. I think the word friends is probably the most important thing in my life. Just to give you another way that God kind of did some showing off in my life, found myself short of medical insurance when I needed to get into that treatment center. So my sponsor took me before the judge in Texas, and Texas court committed me, and they paid $3,200 for my first big book, and I thought I was pretty grateful for someone that would do that. Well, about 7 years later, I find myself in a real nasty divorce with all kinds of stuff going on, and that same judge is presiding over my case. And I walked through that door and I just looked at him and I shook my head. And he knew who I was and I knew who he was. And there were some issues over on the other side, and I won't get into that. But I was really concerned for my daughters. And that judge who court committed me to a treatment center 7 years earlier saw fit to give me residential custody of those 3 girls. That doesn't happen in a normal world. Because in Texas, those babies are the judge's kids. That's exactly the way they talk down there. Now, having raised those 3 girls, I used to get all kinds of ranch and oil scenarios from my sponsor. I'd come in there and I'd be looking at him and just be all the colors out of my face, and he'd look at me and say, "You're out riding the range again, huh?" I said, "What?" He says, "You're out riding the range again. Herding them cats." Is exactly what I was doing. Now, I came out of a pretty structured business arena, so I thought I'd bring that into my home where the 3 girls are. That did not work. As a matter of fact, they'll tell you today that they raised me well, and that's pretty much the way that it went. More surrender is always required for me. My sponsor was the kind of a guy that he was always a gentleman, and he believed in that in the programs. I was probably 7, 8 months sober, and I found myself looking around. As a matter of fact, a fellow by the name of Jan, a gal by the name of Jan, actually gave me this book from the treatment center, and she and I were the only ones in the AA meetings. Everybody else was gone that we had just before us in our treatment center group and within about a month after us. And I started hearing a whole bunch of stuff about relapse, and it sounded pretty good. Some of it was pretty funny, and I also heard the pain, and I remember going to my sponsor saying, I don't think I'm qualified to be in Alcoholics Anonymous because I have not relapsed. And he sent me to a convention that we had in Abilene that it was coming up that weekend. There was a fella coming in from California, and he talked about that. And he gave us permission to not relapse. First time I ever heard anybody give people permission to not relapse. And I've heard it said many other ways. Doesn't make those of you who have any less than those of us who haven't. I carry a little peach pit with me. It's a carved out peach pit that a fella gave me in Abilene, Texas. He was 65 years old the year that I moved here in 2005. He had been trying to get 1 year of sobriety for 35 years and couldn't get it. I wasn't his sponsor, but for about the last 5-6 years or so, we became fast friends. He was always sitting in the back of the room with a knife whittling on something. Well, this little peach pit that he gave me, he got his 1 year about a month before I moved to North Carolina. And he gave me this peach pit. And it's actually a little monkey. And he said, the monkey's off my back. Why don't you take it to North Carolina? Maybe it'll stay off my back. So just those kinds of interaction with people. You touch me at a level that no one's ever been able to touch me at. Because I didn't have the slightest idea what it meant to be vulnerable as a man. I wasn't taught that in my family. And I damn sure didn't do that in the business arena. And I sure wasn't going to help the guy up off the ground that I just knocked on the ground with my football uniform. Wasn't going to do that either. So, I mean, there were just contradictory statements or behaviors that came into my life that I had no idea how to handle them. And, when I came in here, I really didn't know an awful lot. My sponsor took me through the Big Book. He also took me through the 12 traditions. But we hadn't gotten to the 12 traditions yet. And I found myself in a meeting one time. When you people hooked me and pulled me in here, I was hooked on this spiritual thing. I actually was hungry. And I found myself going to church. At the same time I was going to AA meeting. I was going to about 6 or 7 AA meetings a week. And I was in church with those girls pretty frequently, usually 3 days a week. And I had this favorite little noontime group that I used to go to. There were usually 12, no more than 18. I don't know why that number was always constant, but it was. And I had been to church the night before, and the topic that they brought up in the meeting just paralleled what I had heard the night before in church. Well, its tongue got to wiggling before the teeth could close down in front of it, and the brain could get activated. And I said those 2 words that are probably worse than any words you can say in these meetings, and that would be Jesus Christ. And this old fella sitting across the table from me raised up both his hands and said, son, there's that term of endearment again, we don't put labels on our deities in here. It's God, God of your understanding, higher power, or whatever level you think you need to be at. Well, I'll just have you know that he offended me. And I slid that chair back, and I didn't walk out of that meeting. I marched out of that meeting. And I knew where my sponsor was, and I headed to my sponsor's office. Well, my sponsor, you'll know how I got into that hotel room or motel room. My sponsor was the benevolent pastor of the largest church in Abilene at that time, and all kinds of churches funneled into him so that he could do what he needed to do for money, not just for alcoholics, but for other folks. That money that put me in that motel room came from his church. Well, I go walking in there, and he does what every great, we learn this in sponsorship school, it's called the bobblehead. While I'm talking, he's nodding, and he's smiling, and all that good stuff. And then when I get through and I take a breath, I told him what had happened. He looked at me and he said, son, you just learned a real hard lesson about what an outside issue is. And we hadn't gotten there yet. So he took me over there. And we went through that. And he didn't tell me what to do. But I knew what I needed to do because I knew what the steps were. And I got back in and I talked about that wiggling tongue and everything else to that group. And I apologized profusely for that. Told them it wouldn't happen again. If it did, you could hold me accountable. And you all just welcomed me in just like it never happened. And that is what I find also in this room. The level of forgiveness is just incredible. This is where I come for my sanity medicine. I had no idea how twisted I was with my perceptions and my thinking. I often wonder, I was pretty successful in business, but I often wonder how much more successful I could have been had I had these principles. My sponsor made me write, as a married man with a family of 6, made me write a mission statement with those traditions for my family. I've had businessmen write mission statements for their company with those traditions. And it's interesting how the whole structure and dynamic seems to change when you're able to get that culture in. And so there's lots of things that I've learned over the years. I mean, I could literally talk for a long time, and y'all know that because we've sat down before and done some of this. But Linda told me she was going to fact check me, and if I'd have known that AA provided that service, I probably would have foregone the sponsorship over the years, So that's what my sponsor does all the time. He fact checks me. I have a sponsor today who's about 83 years old. He's a crotchety old guy, came out of Wall Street, New Jersey area, and he is very much different than my first sponsor. But the 4 sponsors that I've had all have one thing in common. They got this very large thread that seems to run through their lives. They love drunks. And they will do anything for a drunk, literally. I've watched my current sponsor go into the woods, scoop a guy up out of a trailer from the middle of his dog, and set him back on his feet. They wouldn't take him in the damn ER, so he put him in his car, drove him around the corner, and called 911 so they come get him with an ambulance, and they took him in that one. Cagey son of a gun, I'll tell you. And that's how, you all kind of snuck up on me like that. I remember my first AA meeting. I'm sitting in there, and y'all are giving out the chips down there, and you asked who wanted the surrender chip, and you said I was the most important person in the room, and I stood up, and my shoulders went back, and my head came up, and I walked down that aisle, and I got my chip. Well, the next night, somebody else was the most important person in that room. That was my first resentment. And I know that because it was on my 4th step, and I talked to my sponsor about it. Y'all are pretty cagey. Put another way, your insight into my humanity is just incredible. And your capacity to share yours to help me with mine is what really keeps me moving down the road. I had one last story that I wanted to share, and it was about I'll save that for another time. I'm just grateful to be here tonight. I have missed your faces. It's been years since I've been over here. Thursday night is usually a time that I have set aside for sponsees. So there's a couple of them that I hope they're starving tonight because they haven't seen me. My ego's still there. But it's just wonderful to see everybody. I really, I miss you so much. I love you. You guys keep me on my toes. I would not know what to do without you. I never could talk like this with someone at a bar. Can you imagine sharing well, I would share my feelings at a bar, but it wouldn't be the way I should be sharing my feelings at a bar, and you know how that works. But being able to come in here and talk, quite frankly, about my flaws and my character defects, my thinking is still flawed. I guess that's why, Bill says the problem's up here between the ears. Oh, I used to tell my sponsor all the time that I'm thinking it through. He said, "Really? You're thinking it through? Really?" Bill says that's where the problem is. What the hell do you want to go up there for all by yourself? Why don't we go over here and do something? And that's what he would have me do. I did look at him one time, and I felt like I was really I was working on that patience thing. And you don't work on patience. It kind of comes to you if you keep doing the program. But I want to work on everything when I get here. And I looked at him, I said, I think I've got that patience thing down. And I was probably, 9, 10 months sober. And he says, "Really? You might want to tell your face that." And about a week later, we didn't have the cell phones and all that good stuff back then in 1994. They were there, but they weren't there to the extent they are now. And about a week later, I got a cartoon in the mail, and I still have it in my collection of stuff. And it was this piece of driftwood with 3 buzzards sitting on it, and they're all kind of talking to one another. The 2 on the lower branches are saying, hey, one says to the other one, I'm getting kind of hungry. I sure hope something dies. And the one on the top branch says, die hell, let's go kill something. That's the extent of my patience. It only goes so far. So thanks for letting me come in here and rattle for a little bit and share a little bit of insight as far as who I am. I appreciate all your personalities. My sponsor used to say principles before personalities, but oh, how those personalities are going to spice up the stew of your life. And you have literally spiced up the stew of my life. I love you. Thank you.